Hi, I'm Jim.
And I'm Kate, and this is the very first episode of the Creative Content Studio podcast.
With this podcast, we're aiming to take you from square one to feeling proficient and comfortable in your journey as a podcaster. So let's get started.
Sure. Okay, so question one. What exactly is a podcast?
It may seem like a very rudimentary start, like right from square one, but that's what we said we're going to do. We're going to start people off from scratch, from the basics. So we've got to start there. What is a podcast? Well, think of it like an on-demand radio show. A piece of content of any particular length, there are no rules in this particular game, that is available on demand through a podcasting platform app. That's essentially it. It's distributed through what's called an RSS feed. If you're used to perhaps like uploading things to YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and so on, often you're uploading those to 3 or 4 different platforms, and you might have made the same piece of content. With podcasting, the way it works is you've created your audio file, you've created your content, maybe it's a video file, you've uploaded it to your podcast hosting site, and they have distributed it to all the podcast platforms. It's as simple as that, really. And the methodology that they use to do it is called an RSS feed. We don't need to really worry about what that is. It's not really relevant to most people's podcast journeys, other than you may see that phrase come up in places, and ultimately think of it as that is somewhere that is being redirected by my podcast hosting site to the platforms. It's a place where my podcast lives. That's where it lives, and it's being sent to the podcast platforms from that hosting site, from that RSS.
Okay. And who can start a podcast?
Anyone, really. I mean, it's an incredibly, like with all of the world of social media, I suppose, everything is democratized in this kind of regard. You can start a podcast today. It's a simple, low bar to entry in terms of technical ability, in terms of cost these days, and so anybody can start one. If you're going to ask, I suppose, the sort of people who would start one, if you've got something to say of any kind, whether you're a business, somebody just with a passion for something, you name it, you can start a podcast. It's a great format because of its kind of ease, and because of its customizability, if that's a word, because of its ability to be whatever you need it to be to get your content out there.
Okay. And why has there been such a huge popularity surge in podcasts of recent years?
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose I don't want to get too deep into a history lesson, but for those who don't kind of who perhaps were too young, maybe even to remember the start of all this. It all started with the iPod, and from the iPod, we had the ability to listen to music on demand, essentially. And with that, people quickly realised, it doesn't have to be just music, it could be radio shows. Radio stations and so on started to parcel up their content, their shows, and make them on demand, make them available, make them podcast. Individual podcasters at the same sort of time started to make their own shows, and it was very much audio focused first, and so it's kind of started from there. And at that point, you probably needed to have a little bit more skill, certainly sort of in terms of audio equipment. You would need to know your way around certain things. You might need some kind of mixing desk or something like that, or an audio interface. And if I've lost people with mixing desk and audio interface, that's exactly the point. It was maybe a little bit more, the bar to entry, like I said, was probably a little bit higher. And I think why it's become so kind of ubiquitous and so easy for people to start podcasts, and why there are so many these days, is because there are a lot of companies, audio companies, tech companies, that have realised that there's a demand for podcasts, and they've essentially democratized it through making equipment lower cost, easier to use. That means that you can start a podcast, straight away that afternoon with relatively little money and relatively little experience. So I think that's why one of the reasons why it's blown up. And I think the other reason it's blown up is because of its, like I kind of said earlier, the nature of the content is so flexible. It can be whatever it wants to be, and particularly with something, if your show is audio only. I mean, more and more shows are audio and video, and I'm sure over the coming kind of episodes we'll talk about why that is. But particularly if your show is kind of audio only, it's relatively easy content to produce. In terms of, when I say easy, it's like it's comfortable to make. Lots of people don't feel comfortable jumping on an Instagram live and talking about whatever it is, or think, I just don't have the time or energy to make a reel for Instagram or a TikTok that has got 3 or 4 different camera angles and is kind of me doing a dance or whatever, because that's the trend at the moment. With podcasts, you can be whatever you want it to be. So if you want to do a 20-minute monologue to get something off your chest, you can do. If you want to make it about a very niche topic, something that you're really passionate about, but is, hasn't necessarily got a big audience, you can do that, and you will develop, you will find an audience through the medium. So it lends itself to being approachable, I would say, as a format, compared to some of the other social media kind of outlets that there are. And like, I suppose the other point I'd make about that is that it's a kind of a sliding scale. As you get more comfortable and your technical knowledge maybe grows and maybe your confidence grows, you can kind of improve the thing that you're putting out there. So you might start literally with talking into your phone. I mean, you could launch a podcast this afternoon talking into your phone, and it would sound okay. It would be all right, be passable, and you could have it out on all the podcast platforms, and it would have cost you zero, literally nothing whatsoever. But you can scale that as you go through the journey, so you can end up, in a studio like this with, multiple cameras and lights and so on and so forth, and that doesn't have to happen immediately. It's not like it has to be like that straight away. It can be whatever it needs to be for the place that you're at. And I think that's really helped people get into it. It doesn't feel as intimidating as, I need to make the lighting and everything perfect for me to do this TikTok dance, to use that example.
Okay. And is there like one or maybe more than one myth that you'd like to bust about podcasting here and now?
Yeah, I guess I've kind of done it already, but in my last answer. But I think probably the biggest myth is that it's difficult. I think it, like I said, it can be as difficult as you want to make it, but it doesn't have to be. Really doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't have to adhere to any particular rules, in terms of, the content doesn't have to be this long. You don't have to say these things. There are things that will help improve, your discoverability of your show and perhaps the engagement that you get with your show. There's things like that. But if you want to make your show 5 minutes every day, you can do. If you want to make it 1 hour every month, you can do. If it needs to be a 3-hour conversation between you and a friend and it comes out once a fortnight, it can do. There doesn't have to be these rules and so on. And I think there's a lot of people out there. I mean, this isn't unique to podcasting. You see this with everything. Jump on YouTube or go onto Google or whatever and search for anything that you're looking to do. Look for, how do I make a TikTok in 2025? And you will have people espousing very specific things that you have to do. This is the only way that you will make your podcast successful in 2025. And I personally believe, and from experience, having done it for a few years now, I don't think you need to adhere to any particular rules around it. There are some guidelines that will help you, but you make the content that suits the message that you want to put out there.
Sure. And is it too late to start one now for anyone that's out there thinking about it?
I've heard people say this, that podcasting's saturated, and you hear this, it's almost become a bit of a joke now, like a bit of a meme, like everyone's got a podcast. And they do. Lots of people have a podcast. There's over 4 million active shows right now. But I think the big thing to remember with there's 4 million active shows, that there's 90% of them haven't gone beyond episode 10. So, consistency, sticking at it, getting better, being willing to improve as you go, all of those things, if you're comfortable with those things, you can get beyond episode 10 and you can have a successful podcast for sure. I would never let that be a barrier to your entry to think, well, there's all the podcasts have been done. Like, they haven't. They really haven't. Think about radio stations, think about just content, media, entertainment, information, whatever, the invention of the television. You could go back. No one said, "Oh, we've got all the TV shows now. That's it. We've got all the radio shows now. That's it. We better stop doing the radio." I think anybody can have a podcast, and I would argue should, if they've got something to say. Whether it's about their business, whether it's about a passion. I think it's one of the most rewarding and, like I said before, approachable mediums that there is, in terms of if we bucket it in as a social media content creation. I think it's one of the. I think it is the best, in my opinion. It's the most approachable, the easiest to get into, the most rewarding.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim. Okay, I think that concludes episode 1.
It concludes it.
It does, yeah.
I like it was very formal.
Yeah. I know. Is that too formal for a podcast?
No,
episode?
I don't think so. We could look. There's no rules, like I said.
Well, yeah, I'm going to use the word concludes then.
You could use the word concludes if you want. So I can't remember what we're going to talk about on the next episode.
I think in episode 2, more around the type of different podcast formats and which ones are maybe suitable for the kind of your podcast goals.
Okay.
What you want to achieve, how you want your podcast to look.
Okay, cool.
How it suits your ideas.
And if we're both wearing the same clothes, that means we've probably batch recorded
potentially.
it.
So look out for that. I might have a different jumper on, or I might not.
A little glimpse behind the wizard's curtain. Right, I better keep quiet.
Stop talking.
Thank you.